the Army, as well as Deputy Commander General Support for U.S. Forces in Iraq. Please join me in welcoming Tom Spohr. Tom?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. This panel, I think, could not come at a more opportune time, given the renewed emphasis by the President, his administration, on rebuilding the nation's defenses. I think it's probably very wise to look at the underpinning of that rebuilding, which is, in fact, our industrial base. President Trump's executive order that he signed on the 21st of July calls for a comprehensive whole-of-government review of the defense industrial base and the supply chain resiliency of the United States, with that report due, I think, in around April of 2018. And then finally, just to highlight this, on Tuesday, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, mentioned that we have an increasingly brittle industrial base that may not be able to support our forces in the case of a prolonged war. We are fortunate today to have a group of experts to discuss this important topic. Starting from my left, he is the Honorable Jerry McGinn, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. Prior to assuming this position, Dr. McGinn worked in the private sector in defense consulting in several firms, and before that served in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Near and dear to my heart, he's a former Army infantry officer with a PhD from Georgetown University. To his left is Mr. Bill Greenwald, currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Greenwald has served as a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Policy in the George W. Bush administration, has worked in the defense industry at the American Enterprise Institute, and has served as a professional staff member for the Senate Armed Services Committee, where he handled acquisition matters. Mr. Greenwald has written extensively on acquisition and the industrial base, and he holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Southern California. To his left, Mr. Stephen Rodriguez, the founder of One Defense, also a co-sponsor of today's panel, a nationwide defense and consortium and advisory firm, and a senior fellow at New America, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. Steve is a venture capitalist who specializes in aerospace and defense investment. He holds a master's degree in international security from Georgetown University. And our final panelist is Ms. Rachel Zizimos, a research associate in the Center for National Defense here at the Heritage Foundation. Rachel has researched and written on the defense industrial base and on defense spending in general, and she holds a master's degree from George Mason University in public policy. So I'd ask you to welcome our distinguished panelists, please. So each of our panelists is going to provide us some introductory remarks, and then at the end of that, we hope to take some questions from the audience, so please be thinking about that. And so I think we will begin with you, Dr. McGinn, please, sir.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and it's great to see Steve and Bill and Rachel, to meet you, and see many familiar faces in the crowd. It's good to be back at Heritage and to talk about this important topic. As Tom alluded to, the administration has placed a lot of priority on the defense industrial base. And so that is good news for me, but it creates a lot of work which we are actively trying to complete for the department and for the broader U.S. government and the president. So what I thought I'd do briefly is talk a bit about how we're currently organized, and then talk really about the executive order, because I think that's why most of you here are here. So we have three main lines of effort in our organization. One line is focusing on advanced manufacturing, where we do some cross-cutting or niche manufacturing programs that are in the areas of advanced manufacturing. We do additive manufacturing, public-private partnerships with industry, and through our Manufacturing USA Institutes. We also help build capacity in the defense industrial base through some really tremendous authorities under the Defense Production Act that allows us to build new facilities, new factories to meet industrial-based needs. And then we also have some specific manufacturing technology programs that are designed for places where there aren't specific program requirements yet, but there are needs for one of the services or for the broader national security requirements. So we do have a small number of those programs that we do, and we work actively with Congress and stakeholders across the department to conduct those. the second main line of effort is focused around industrial base assessments and mergers and acquisition reviews. So there we do our classic industrial base assessments. We've been doing these for many years. We do them. We have an annual industrial capabilities report to Congress, which I think I've told many of you all. My proudest bureaucratic accomplishment is I got it when I arrived a couple of years ago. We were 3 years behind in those. I largely attribute that to Bill's mistakes, but we are now fully caught up on those reports, and that is the baseline for the current effort we're doing, which I'll get to in a moment. But we do those in many different sectors. We work very closely with the NOAA departments and other agencies in the government, Department of Commerce, NASA, Department of Energy, and the like. So, and then as part of that, we also do mergers and acquisitions review. We're part of the interagency committee that is led by the antitrust agencies, which is Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission. We review mergers and acquisitions for competition and for specific DoD equity. So some of your companies, those represented companies here in the room, have started to get us quite busy, and expect that to not let up anytime soon. But it's an area we take very, very seriously. And the third line of effort is focusing on what we call global markets and investments, or foreign direct investments. And that is our committee, CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. There we are part of, again, another interagency committee that is led by the Department of Treasury, focusing on protecting, looking at the implications of foreign direct investment on national security. So there we're trying to making sure that investments do not impinge on technologies that are critical to U.S. national security requirements. So we do those. Those are our three main lines of effort, and then we have the two, what I call cross-cutting threads. And one is on industry outreach. We're the main belly button for industry for the undersecretary and for much of the department. And we work with the trade associations. We're here, these kind of engagements to be able to articulate the department's views on industrial matters. And then the second one is on business intelligence and analytics, where one of the things we're moving to is, I've got a great staff. I've got a rocket scientist. I've got a PhD from MIT and EE, so he's my microelectronics expert. But, they do great point-in-time analysis, but so we need to get more proactive and predictive. And so we're using big data analytics. We're developing a platform which we should have launched on the DoD unclassified network within the next month, that will allow us, that helps us analyze trends in the defense industrial base, so we can attack them and try to mitigate them in advance, instead of dealing with them at the 5-yard line when there's this critical problem. So that's what we do, and so it's very timely that the president signed out this executive order in July. And when I saw the initial drafts, I was like, okay, we got a large task in front of us. How are we going to tackle this? And so we've been working very diligently with the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy in the White House, as well as our interagency partners and our DoD stakeholders, to address this executive order. And just to summarize, the requirements of the executive order are to identify, essential materials, raw materials and goods, and manufacturing capabilities, and then to assess supply chain risks and potential disruption, and the resiliency and capability of the defense industrial base. And this is a piece that is new that I will touch on. And then to lead out of that, recommend some policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations to the president to address and mitigate these identified shortfalls. And that is due actually on April 17th, and we are on track to deliver well in advance of that. So that is I've got a clear timeline. We are moving towards that. Our approach to do this has been that, first of all, you're defining the defense industrial base, and in that you have several components, of both a private sector and a public sector component. The public sector are the organic assets, the depots, arsenals, and shipyards, and the private sector are the traditional defense industrial base. That's the prime contractors, the mid-tier, and the smalls, but also commercial companies, companies that don't necessarily do a lot of business in defense, but they have an impact. Then our focus of the analysis on the near term in the next 5 years. What are some of the challenges facing the current industrial base? And then we're looking at it by sector. If you look at our capabilities report, we break it out by aircraft, ships, and so on. So we're looking at those classic sectors as well as some cross-cutting issues such as workforce development. And yes. So the three kind of questions that are guiding us in this are, first, what is our baseline industrial capacity and what is our surge capacity? That's both identifying strengths and shortfalls. Where do we have risks? And what are the source of those risks? Is it result from a sole source or a single source, fragile suppliers, and the like? And then what constrains the ability of the base to meet operational needs? So to address these questions, we've got an interagency task force as well as a DoD cross-functional team, synced by, led by our office and with our undersecretary and the White House very, very much leading as well, to analyze the current state of the industrial base. And this, fortunately, we've got a great set of data for that. We've got about a 75% kind of solution, estimated. If you're looking at, because we've done a lot of current analysis on many areas, and there's a lot of ongoing attention in specific sectors where we've identified challenges. So that gives us a pretty good view of the current state, and we're look to build on that with additional analysis. So we're doing the current state, but the thing that the executive order asks us to do is to look at how the industrial base will be able to surge to meet future operational contingencies. And this is what is new for this effort, and we're doing that. We're going to model that using some of the tools that we use for other operational scenario needs. So that will lead to the final recommendations that we make in the spring. But the one thing where we don't have, so we've got a good basis of initial information. What we don't have is information on some of the operational production needs or production requirements to feed into this model. So we are going to go out with a request for a questionnaire to industry for focusing narrowly on where they have production capability, to understand the production capability in the products they support the warfighter with, so that we can use that in our analysis. And so that will be launching shortly. And then finally, just to wrap up, this effort is a major thrust and importance for the department and for the U.S. national government. And one of the key things of my boss, Ms. Lord, is that she wants to make sure that we're synced with the other efforts going on, and that's the national defense and national security strategy, which are also under development, and that's very much is happening. So we stay, with one effort supporting the overall needs of the department and the country. So.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McGinnis. So, Bill Greenwald, sir, can we go to you?
All right. Happy to do that. I was asked to discuss kind of where Congress is in all of this, or has been, and historically. And I'll try to do that without impinging too much on Jerry's area. But, I'll have to say a few things. Come on, The basis for industrial-based planning in Congress's eyes are outlined in Title 10, 2501, and that whole kind of subchapter of Chapter 148 of Title 10 U.S. Code. And what Congress has always been split on this issue. There's the one, I would say, the more righteous portion of it is how to manage the industrial base to meet all those contingencies and mobilization and operational planning and things like that. And so there is a requirement in 2501 for a strategy, an industrial-based strategy, which actually, and I'll comment here in a minute, is really the executive order for DoD. Now, the executive order is broader than that and takes a whole of government approach. But essentially, Congress has asked throughout the years for basically industrial-based strategy for a number of reasons. In the past, having been there, the industrial-based strategy of the Department of Defense has been more of a laissez-faire, ad hoc, basically address critical components when they come up. And I think Congress has always been looking for a more forward-looking strategy, and I think the executive order is trying to do that as well. Now, I said there's a righteous side of industrial-based planning, and then there's kind of a more parochial side of industrial-based planning when you look at this issue in Congress. And if you look at Chapter 148, you'll see that along the lines of these great strategies and focusing the United States on meeting national security needs, there are also areas where Congress has decided to legislate what may be called directed targeted earmarks or policy earmarks. And in some cases, these are valid. In some cases, there's some question, but it is the law. And so you have this Buy America protectionism side of the house versus how do we meet the mission? And so what's happened in the last couple years in this area is actually Congress has not really legislated much in this area for decades, maybe. I mean, little minor changes to in there. But the last couple years, they have. And the areas that I want to, last year, in kind of concern and trying to drive the department to relook at the strategy, they did something very interesting, not in a parochial sense. They essentially added the UK and Australia to the definition of the National Technology Industrial Base, which is the basis for all industrial-based planning in law. It's a basis for that strategy. So that's the first thing they did. The second thing they did is to re-emphasize and focus on the non-defense portion. Oh, that's all right. That's all right. I'm hearing reverb. Back. It's funny to hear yourself speak there, on a time delay. Anyways, the second area was to bring in and more closely align the commercial side of the industrial base to the defense industrial base. And those changes were made last year and all directed to try to focus the department on when it revamps its industrial-based strategy. Now this year we have an interesting phenomenon as well, and I have to say on the executive branch side you see the same thing of mission-orientedness and parochialism as you see the executive order on industrial-based planning, which is how do we achieve the mission, how do we mobilize, and as General Dunford is very concerned of, there are definitely some needs to look at how can we conduct a long war against a near peer or somebody like North Korea, and is the industrial base capable of doing that, and what how long it would actually take to initiate that. So you have on that side, but then you also have the Buy America executive order as well. And so in Congress you have like I say you have the same thing. Although this year in Congress is different. If you look at the Senate bill has taken, at the recommendation of, I would say, the last 3 or 4 Department of Defenses, and Secretary of Defenses and 18Ls or whatever, to repeal much of this Buy America underlying provisions in the underlying law. And what's very interesting about that is if you look at the Statement of Administration policy from this administration, instead of the support that would probably most of the past administrations have given, they basically expressed their opposition, setting up a very interesting dynamic in industrial-based planning, which, essentially, I think whenever you look at this, you see these two sides, and that discussion will most likely resolve itself in this year's conference between the House and Senate on the NDAA. So with that, so there are really some positive things going on in industrial-based planning. the updating a strategy, implementing the executive order, seeing whether Congress is going to be more protectionist or less protectionist than the administration is something that I think we all have to kind of watch in the coming year. So with that, I'll turn it over to my next esteemed colleague.
Thank you, sir. Stephen Rodriguez, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being here. I figured I'd lead off with a quote. Many people, when you talk about the defense industrial base, people often view it in a negative light, and they immediately quote, Eisenhower's famous last speech, right, which talks about the dangers of the defense industrial base or the military industrial complex, and it's this kind of shadowy, menacing menace to society. And what's interesting is I was researching this topic, and I found a quote literally in the same breath uttered by Ike in that speech, which is kind of the proverbial rest of the story. And what he says is, to quote, right after he says the famous quote about warning against the dangers of an establishment like this, he says, a vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. The whole peace through strength motto. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. So I was thinking of this recently because probably like many of you, I've been watching the Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War. And what's amazing is if you watch, I think, episode 1 and 2, they talk about basically the run-up to the war. And Ike is prominently featured in this, basically not only having experienced World War II in Korea, but now literally staring down the barrel, much more so than I previously understood, staring down the barrel of the Vietnam War. It was as clear to him as it was to Johnson and Kennedy, the dangers, but also the irresistible force that was drawing America into that war. So it was. I've thought a lot about this, both from sharing kind of how we got here, which a lot of people know those facts, right? About the fact that we have one manufacturer of LCD displays, no domestic LED or solar capability. We recently shot down the foreign takeover of Lattice, which is a semiconductor producer. One single producer of naval propellers. Limited ball bearing manufacturing production. So this is, I've often talked with my friends in DOD and I've said, hey, this is happening to us, right? This is not something that that may one day happen, or like the Budget Control Act or sequestration. It's something that we kind of impose on ourselves and we have to wrangle through. Like, this is happening daily. So I think taking a step back, I wanted to talk a little bit about some broad investment themes, since I guess that's my primary role for existing on this panel. Investment themes, but more importantly, what's driving those investment themes? Because what I've seen in DOD is when technology is not matched with a mission set, it tends to founder. And actually, we've seen that with things from flashlights all the way up to things such as the FCS, Future Combat System. So I'll share a couple things with you. So 3 major themes behind a lot of what our technology base or the industrial base has responded to really happened since the Cold War, or in many cases, it's kind of a return, as I call it, to the bad old days. One, rapid scaling of anti-access aerial denial capability. So things such as the Russian S-400 and S-500 missile threat. 2, the return of, and I emphasize this, originally when I was typing up my notes, I just typed in asymmetric conflict, and I said, well, actually, it's really a return to that. It's not, that was kind of the de rigueur for most of our history until the Cold War. So these are things such as insurgencies that we are grappling with, and terrorism. And then lastly, a return to what we call today hybrid warfare, which is really what multi-domain battle that TRADOC's been leading the way on, responding to. has emanated from. So what have we done in response to these major themes? One, we initially had the revolution in military affairs, which I think a lot of us were a part of that response. These are things where actually FCS was one of many things that came out of that, and yet it foundered in the response to the Iraq War primarily. We had bigger problems on our hands. So what kind of came out of that was something that I call multi-spectrum requirements, and these are basically the current response to these urgent mission sets. So things such as augmented and virtual reality, artificial intelligence, which again, to avoid falling into the cyber definition trap, I characterize more specifically as cognitive computing and neural networks. Okay. Advanced manufacturing, something that's near and dear to Jerry's heart. And lastly, hypersonic weapons. So these are attempts to short circuit the conventional buildup and matching of military to military capabilities with speed and with ingenuity inside the technology base. Now the challenge is innovation in the space does not only occur in DoD labs. In fact, in many cases, it occurs exclusively in the commercial industry as well as in the academic world. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because in years past, like in World War II, back when Ike was commanding the forces, a company such as Ford Motor Company could make a military Jeep, right? They could make Jeeps, they could make airplanes, they could make barrels for howitzers. And yet today, relatively, and I say this with respect, but relatively unsophisticated platforms such as the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, JLTV, are made by a consortium of highly specialized, exclusively to the defense industrial base manufacturers, because they're laden with highly specific platforms. That is the underlying challenge that we're all dealing with. It's that not any Tom, Dick, or Harry can make a military platform anymore. And honestly, that's for very good reason. This applies to the software world as well. There are things such as authority to operate and being FIPS compliant. These are extremely good reasons why you can't just load the coolest app you have on your iPad at home onto a DoD network. And yet, that's not good enough. So this is, I think, in many ways what's driving the National Trade Council, Jury's office, and a lot of us on the panel to respond effectively to this, because this is not a situation where we can sit by and say, you know what, that's okay, we'll figure it out eventually, because everyone else is figuring it out. The Chinese are definitely figuring this out. They are investing in American software and hardware technology, often funded by government R&D, and incorporating it into their own defense industrial base 2 to 3 years faster than we are. So when I was in college in the 1990s, I heard all these horrible stories about the Chinese coming in and like stealing all of our stuff, right? That's not even, I'm certain that's the case. And there are plenty of briefings that don't occur in this room that would give specifics on that. Having said that, they're not even doing that anymore. They're just now taking it in the open. There was a company called, that was featured in a New York Times article called Neurala, a neural networking company. Neurala does incredible advanced artificial intelligence capability. A number of defense customers wanted to work with them. And yet they got stuck in the DoD procurement timeline, which is 12 to 18 months, also roughly analogous to Moore's Law, which says technology doubles every 12 to 18 months. In fact, if anything, that timeline is getting shorter. So while they're stuck in this kind of the procurement timeline that we all deal with, right, and that's a burden we shoulder, they were raising the next capital round. They're a venture-backed company, so you tend to raise money in 12 to 18-month cycles. So they're burning down on their existing capital raise. They go out to raise their next round in the middle of all this, while dealing with In-Q-Tel, while dealing with the Air Force specifically. And a Chinese investment company came along and said, hey, we'd love to invest in your next investment round. We like what you're doing. Your thesis makes sense. Investment thesis makes sense. So In-Q-Tel and the Air Force found out and immediately came in and said, if you take money from them, you can no longer do business with us. And the response was actually not what you might think. The response was the CEO, a guy literally named Maximilian Versace. I mean, you can't make this up. Literally, didn't literally, figuratively shot them in the face and said, who do you think you are? You are an infinitesimally small customer for us, even at your maximum potential. Basically, please go away. And of course, this found its way into a New York Times article as well, thus allowing all of us to share in the incredible story. So the reason I share this, and I'll end here, is that these are the dynamics that we are dealing with. It's not enough, and we've heard this before, it's not enough to say that we're the sole customer or even the best customer. In many cases, I think the new dynamic that us as an industrial base will have to grapple with is that we may even be the minority customer for a lot of these commercial firms who have no desire in setting up a defense business practice, no desire in having an office in Washington, D.C., no desire with understanding what the FAR or compliance with the DCA audit looks like. So these are things that we have to address now because, again, these are happening to us whether we deal with it or not.
Thank you very much, Steve. Rachel, over to you, please.
So a lot of great points, a few I'd like to expand on, and then a couple issues I would like to address with what I see as possibly the results of the study. So first, as Stephen mentioned, we've kind of done this to ourselves. There are a few problems I see as having contributed to a brittle industrial base, those being a decrease in defense spending, particularly in areas of procurement and research and development, a tendency to focus on costs and efficiency in our acquisitions practices over capability and value, and then instability and inconsistency in the budget process. So the first of those, spending is far down. I'd be surprised, frankly, if the industrial base wasn't brittle at this point. We just haven't been buying as much as we have in the past. So producers aren't producing as much as they did in the past. So in the past 20 years, we've produced 2 fighter aircraft. We've got the F-22, and we cut the procurement numbers for that in half. And then we've got the F-35. And what we did with the F-35 is for both the airframe and the engine, we whittled down the producer to one company or one major contractor. And that I see as an issue in focusing on cost and efficiency. So we've taken multiple airframes and thrown all of our eggs in, or aircraft, and thrown all of our eggs in one basket, and given that entire responsibility for a huge number of aircraft to one company. So it makes it harder, and that's going to be produced for the next 20 years. So that section of the market is gone for other companies to compete right now. And there's an issue there that I see in that we tend to look at redundancy as inefficiency or as waste, but it's not necessarily true in the DoD. There's a lot of value that can come out of this and capability, because the DoD and the defense industrial base doesn't operate like a regular market. So if you take the F-16 in the early 2000s, there was an issue with the engines that they noticed, and it grounded a large percentage of the fleet. What happens with the F-35 and we've got one engine across the fleet and across multiple services if we find a similar issue like that? Sometimes we can look at these decisions and say maybe the answer is to go with both. Maybe we award more contracts. We don't necessarily need to. Maybe we prioritize the better choice, the more capable choice, over the cheapest option we have. And in that way, we're continuing to advance our technology and giving more opportunities to the industrial base, even if it might not necessarily be the cheapest option available. So competition, in this case, in the industrial base, is not solely about cost savings. In the next, the budget needs stability and consistency for these companies to be able to invest in long-term productive capacity. they're waiting on signals from Congress, and for the past 17 years, there have been 14 continuing resolutions. So it makes it impossible for these companies to try to plan and invest long-term, invest in productive capacity. We're making these 30-year shipbuilding plans or Marine Corps aviation plans, but we're not sticking to them. So if we would just stick to what we've called the requirements, that would do, I think, wonders for the defense industrial base, and it's something that we should be doing already. And there are areas where we can supplement or assist in some of the issues we're having. So commercial industries, Steve mentioned, are producing a lot of great technologies, but they are minor. We're not going to see aircraft carrier hulls or fighter airframes coming out of Silicon Valley. It's just not going to happen. Some of these areas have to be funded through the defense budget, and that's really the only way. We're just not going to get them through dual-use technologies. And then a couple of the concerns I have regarding the executive order. So the scope is one. The DoD, as mentioned, conducts an annual review of the industrial base and capabilities, and this is much broader. The Defense Production Act, over multiple reauthorizations, expanded the definition of national security and critical items to include a lot of other areas, including energy security and critical infrastructure. This was a big part of what enabled the Obama administration's military biofuels initiative, which in my opinion, especially considering the problems we're facing now, is a wasteful endeavor when we're barely meeting our current requirements across our fleets. So I just want to make sure there that when we're looking at issues of criticality, that's clearly defined and prioritized, that we're making sure the military has what it needs, and we're not getting sidetracked on any sort of pet projects. And then second is that the results could potentially be used as a justification for protectionism. This was also referenced. So I want to make sure that we steer clear of that and just focus on the issues that are causing the industrial base to be brittle, rather than putting a Band-Aid on some of the shortfalls we're seeing right now and vulnerability, just going back to the root problems. But there are a lot of other ways to strengthen our industrial base without U.S. investment, and that is the primary one in my opinion, but there are opportunities like the National Technology Industrial Base to increase opportunities for trade and cooperation with our close allies and partners, and then expanding opportunities for foreign military sales. So too often, some of our long-standing and trusted allies are subjected to the same bureaucratic processes and restrictions as our competitors and our adversaries. So in that area, I think it's very important that we balance these restrictions, which are certainly there for a reason, but that we balance these restrictions with the ability of U.S. industries to compete. So some of the technologies that we have protected in the past, sensitive technologies or advanced technologies, are now out there on a global scale. So China is selling UAVs much less judiciously than I think the U.S. has, and we still are placing heavy restrictions on U.S. industries as far as exports. So I think we might need to revisit that and see what protections we really are getting through these restrictions, and whether or not we'd be better served loosening them and enabling our allies to have access to these technologies as well, since there are other places in the world now that they can access them. So summing it up, I agree. I think we've done this to ourselves. I think the biggest issue is the budget, and is going to be the budget until it's fixed. We need to increase spending on procurement and research and development, which is hard to do currently, and I understand the prioritization of readiness, but readiness is not going to help our industrial base. Sustaining old systems over modernizing and developing new systems is not going to achieve the same effect. And then, focusing on issues of cost and efficiency over capability and value, and providing stability and consistency to the budget to enable long-term planning. I think that's going to get us where we need to be.
Great, Rachel. Thank you very much. Well, a lot of stuff to talk about there, a lot of things to consider, some room for pessimism, maybe a little bit of room for optimism out there. We've got some time now for questions, and so I'd ask, there are people with microphones, I think, and so wait for the microphone to arrive at your place so that our viewers that are hearing this online can hear your question. Then state your name and your organization, and if you would like to direct your question to a particular panelist, mention that as well. So I think, sir, you were first right there, please.
Hello, Tony Bertuca with Inside Defense. A question for Mr. McGinn. When is your RFI coming out? And then also you mentioned that the surge capacity was sort of a new thing, that once you gathered all your data, you would then try to see if you could put it through the paces and stress the industrial base for surging. Surging for what? What are some of the scenarios that you want the industrial base to be ready for?
I guess I'll take the second question first. As you well know, we do operational scenario planning all the time in the Department of Defense for various scenarios in different parts of the world, and that's what our Joint Staff and the military departments do with the COCOMs for operational planning. That has not been done except in a couple of narrow aspects for the industrial base. It has been done in strategic materials, and we're currently doing work on munitions because it's been public that the operational needs for PGMs has been significant. So, but we haven't done it for the industrial base. So that's what we're doing in this effort. And so that effort, we're using the same organization that does that modeling for the department to do this and adapting that to look at how the industrial base will be stressed or could be stressed under specific operational scenarios. And that will allow us to see potential production bottlenecks and the like. And that's the place where we don't have a lot of information.
Will we ever know the scenarios, or are those going to be?
Well, the reason why I'm being vague is I think the answer is probably not. The output of the analysis will certainly be classified. All our operational planning is classified, and but it's going to inform the findings and recommendations of the report. Our thinking, and this was in the executive order, is that we'll have an unclassified report and with a classified annex, and so that work on the surge and frankly some of the sensitive findings will not be public likely. So to answer your first question, for us to understand the production rates, minimum sustaining rate, other things that we have not specifically, and we engage with industry all the time. And we look at we specifically look at industrial sectors where we see potential weaknesses, and we work closely with these companies and the trade associations on that. But we don't have a lot of information of how we would do in this kind of scenario. So we're finalizing a very targeted request, and this is a voluntary request where we give industry the opportunity to provide some information, help us do this analysis. And we can make estimates and do it on our own, and we're going to do that. But the greater the information that we have from industry on some of their challenges, and because we have our known knowns, we know where we have some specific challenges, but there are a lot of areas where we don't know, and so that's where that information would be helpful.
Companies don't like to do this typically. Are you worried you're not going to get a holistic picture since it's voluntary?
That's the price of doing business. You know, I think we have to make the effort and provide the opportunity, and it's been our judgment is probably the best course of action.
Are we talking like weeks for the RFI?
Or? It's going to be very shortly, and it will be yes. And again, it's not going to be a formal RFI in terms of, it's not going to be a Fez biz ops, but we're going to use the associations and for companies to request a very targeted questionnaire and to respond as they like, and we'll have be able to address any questions that industry has as they're trying to respond.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Hey, Tom, can I? Let me give you something that you can kind of take away that is open source. So one of the biggest anchors around most federal agencies' necks is data, like getting it, organizing it, making use of it. Not to throw my buddy Bob Daigle, who's now the CAPE director, under the bus, but they don't even have the data. from the suppliers of their own. This is a constant struggle. So in terms of what we do about it, the good news is this is a tremendous opportunity for the defense industrial base. So both within Jerry's shop as well as other federal agencies are appearing to understand this. So from the commercial sector, what is the one thing that you can't get enough of, the biggest commodity that you desperately need, the reason why Google gives you all these great, products for free? It's your data. Like, if you use Google Maps to get here, guess what the transaction was? They take your data, right? They monitor how many times I walk across the street to Dolcezza to get my coffee, right? And then what do you know? I get, predictive analytics showing me where the closest Dolcezza is. So NGA actually is doing this right now. NGA is starting a new public-private partnership, a venture fund, if you will, and the commodity that they're offering is not capital. It's not like an In-Q-Tel thing where they give you some money and like anyone can give you money. The thing that they're giving you is their data that they produce terabytes of each day. And it's I think a way forward for many people in this room as well as across the government in leveraging a commodity that no one outside in the commercial world can benefit from. I think too often we want to be like Google or be like Facebook, right? If only we could have kind of, beautiful colors on the wall and a cafeteria offering, the latest, farm fresh eggs and whatever else. And sure, that would be nice. But the bigger thing is, why are we competing with these organizations and trying to be like them rather than offering something that no one in the commercial world can offer? So I think NGAs understands this. Other organizations within the Department of Defense appear to understand this as well. So they're starting to leverage their data as a way both to entice commercial activity, number one, and I think number two, realizing that gives them an advantage within their own operations. I think data is a powerful thing, but data also represents information and knowledge. And in this town, information and knowledge often come at a premium.
Let me just add to that a couple points. What the department's doing right now is definitely what is needed. But I think what you're going to find, and unfortunately Jerry may find, is the capability to do this kind of assessment has been lost since the Cold War. In other words, we used to have a tremendous amount of industrial-based analysts in the services doing this on a day-to-day basis, and frankly, we don't have them anymore. I mean, I used to have the staff. Your staff is a little bit bigger, but not much than what I used to have. And, we would tin cup to try to do kind of, not necessarily operational scenarios, but just like what would happen if a tornado destroyed, a critical plant in, down in Georgia or something. What would that impact? And, so we try to do those scenarios, but frankly, we didn't have the capability 10 or 15 years ago, and I doubt we have it today.
Great. Sir, over there, please.
Good morning, Daniel Ogden, National District Export Council. So I wanted to direct a question to Dr. McGinn about export controls. Now, two primary agencies that regulate U.S. exports for control purposes are DDTC and BIS, and that's the Bureau of Industry and Defense Director of Trade Control. So what involvement will they have in terms of relation to this executive order? I know there's interagency discussions when it comes to license requirements, et cetera, but what I'm wondering is specifically in relation to this executive order, how involved will these two agencies be in terms of implementation?
Well, both state and Commerce are very involved in the executive order, but this is not an export control review or anything. It so happens that the folks doing from Commerce participating is BIS, because
Right.
they also do the industrial surveys, so industry surveys, but there's no connection to export controls in this.
So in terms of the industrial base, I mean, it seems to me that there would be concern about advanced technologies being exported. I mean, doesn't that come into play? I understand it's not related specifically to manufacturing, but in the overall industrial base strategy, export controls is not a concern?
No, well, it's absolutely a concern, but the way I guess I would frame it is that our charter is to look at the companies and capabilities that support the manufacturing and defense industrial base. And so from that, like with any country wants to keep their critical technologies. They want to make as much of that as possible in their home country. And this is not the U.S. This is any country, right? So in the analysis we do on all different areas. We look at those industrial capabilities that we need that are critical for our systems that support the warfighter, and do analysis to understand is there enough demand to keep that company healthy. What is their supply chain to the degree that we can analyze it? There's working with having a supply chain in the UK and Canada is very different from the supply chain that is in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. So in that aspect, that's how we would cross into those kind of issues. But and then of course, like I say, we already look at the implications for the defense industrial base of both domestic transactions through M&A reviews as well as through CFIUS for foreign direct investment. So those are related, but not they're part of the picture. But what we're looking here is more at the capabilities and how they support our national security priorities. Does that help?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sir, in the middle here. Gentleman right.
Hey, good morning. It's Christopher Zember with Alliance Science and Technology and the National Defense University. So let's talk about ship repair. So I think you all saw Sidney Freeberg's article earlier this week. One of the things he talked about is the collisions in the Pacific and the challenges to the repair of those incidents, those ships, and certainly the challenges that would occur during a conflict scenario. One of the things that Sidney didn't mention, though, is that so far with the collisions that have happened, all of those ships have been sent back to their new build shipyards for repair instead of being sent to smaller shipyards that might be closer. So I just wanted to get your thoughts, maybe Jerry and others, on how that decision's made. Maybe if you don't want to comment on the specifics of these ships, how that decision's made, and how we actually use these opportunities to build up capacity within the smaller shipyards.
I think, and I believe there's a statutory constraint on doing the type of shipyards that are closer to where those were. So that would be foreign shipyards, and so I believe that there's I think they could only do minor repairs. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. I know that's been in statute for a while, and then I'm assuming they just went out and did a quick RFP and figured out who could do this quickly and move in that regard. So I don't know if there was a real industrial base plan there. I think it was just like, let's get the job done quickly.
Yeah, I don't have any knowledge of that. I think that's all been done by the Department of Navy for operational, support, and so it has not been an industrial-based discussion.
Is that something that in the future might be a role for your office, Jerry, to take part in?
Well, we work very closely with the military departments on industrial-based matters. When it comes to specific service equities, we generally kind of they'll lead because they're the experts in shipbuilding and Army's experts in body armor and the like. So we support and assist, but for something that specific, it's not. It's been generally done by those that organize, train, and equip.
But to go back to my earlier comment, the fact that the services have really depleted any industrial-based planning staff, in more than likely there was no consideration whatsoever based on the fact that they didn't have anybody to actually do that. But that's just a guess.
Well, and public shipyards are already struggling to keep up with current demand. So I feel like that could contribute to part of it. It seems like a good opportunity to use some of the private industry's capacity if we can barely turn out our current requirements.
Steve.
This is precisely the point. I think what we're all really talking about is resilience within the the national security base writ large. And one of the things that I've wrestled with is how do you come up with, if you're Jerry or if you're in the White House, how do you come up with analogs for how to deal with this, right? Because this is not something that you can buy your way out of, or more importantly, actually, ironically, as Ike said, you can't improvise on this, right? When the Fitz and the McCain both go down, like, you have what you have. There's no, and to Rachel's point, Google or Tesla or SpaceX aren't gonna be able to bail you out, tomorrow, no matter what kind of RFP is. So I think, as Bill highlighted, they're gonna go on autopilot, issue the RFP. There's gonna be one respondent, probably the people that built it to begin with, and then that's that. I think in terms of analogs for what the hell do we do about this? One way to think about it is commercial investment buys down business risk, right? So if you go to an investor, whoever they are, and candidly, wherever they are, it doesn't matter if they're in China, Israel, Germany, or the U.S., they're going to buy down commercial or business risk, which says, give me something that works, like is technically feasible, and actually is generally functional, what we call past minimum viable product, or MVP, and then I will invest to see if there is a market for this product. Make sense? What's great, and this is the good news, the government world invests in technical risk, right? Hey, I have an idea. It's a white paper here for how you might build a product. Product doesn't exist, but if you give me $250,000 over 14 months, I think I can get it to something that looks like this. Cool. The government will do that. They'll do that deal 6 ways a Sunday. So the opportunity there is finding a pipeline approach where you have government buying down the technical risk of stuff that no investor will touch, right? Because it's too risky, right? Why, if I had $100,000 to invest, why would I invest it if you're just an individual, right, with no ability to scale anything? Why would I invest in something that may or may not work? I would much rather look at something that may or may not work and then say, you know what, I think I know a market that I can help you sell this into, or I can advise you on growth strategy in. So, the big thing that keeps me up at night is, what do you do about this, and especially in the near to midterm? I think long-term planning, I think we can figure it out. But in the short term, the rest of the world isn't waiting for us. The Chinese are producing 4 frigates or destroyers a month, and we're on track to produce 4 a year. I mean, they're quickly becoming master shipbuilders. And here we are repairing, we've got, 4 ships being repaired right now on top of whatever the heck we were supposed to produce this year. So the thing that I would encourage all of us to think about is hybrid commercial government investment models, and then also leveraging the data that we do have towards a lot of these sexy applications that we all say we wish we could do. So augmented and virtual reality, artificial intelligence, big data. Well, guess what? You don't get any of those if you do not have data. You don't get artificial. We can talk all we want about leveraging artificial intelligence to improve better buying power. Well, guess what? None of that works if you don't have the data. That's how big data works. Like, if you don't have data, you just have big something. Like big bureaucracy, right, Bill?
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, next question. In the back, please.
This is Matthew Friesen from O'Brien, Gentry & Scott. My question, I guess, is mostly for Dr. McGinn. How sufficient do you feel your current mechanisms are for dealing with issues in the industrial base? I mean, assuming this analysis comes back and you find, hypothetically, some gaping holes. I mean, I know right now, there's DPA Title III, industrial base sustainment stuff, and DoD, probably some stuff I'm not aware of. But I guess, how does that, going forward, filling those gaps look? I mean, is it just giving DoD more money so that they can fill in the gaps themselves? Is it increasing sole source authority? Is it purely capital influx? Thank you.
Great. Now, that's a great question. I think first the big thing that would help is what Rachel explicitly talked about is stability in budgeting I think there's work to be done in the DoD sense in terms of planning for industrial base, but also budget. For companies to invest. The signal is we're going to be under CR starting Monday. So so that really hurts. So I agree. As far as mitigation tools, there are some that you alluded to. You were supposed to mention a few of them. Defense Production Act, Title III, Industrial Base Analysis and Sustainment Fund. Those are great tools, and they are tools that we use currently to mitigate industrial base identified shortfalls and capability gaps. One of the things we're trying to do, we are doing currently in our office, and the executive order is a great vehicle to help support that as well, is to increase the understanding of that and the ability to utilize these mitigation tools, because they are natural allies. They're natural kind of programs that can help us achieve the outcome that we want in defense industrial base. So, yeah.
If I can add to that, I'm working a little bit on the DPA right now. I certainly think it's a great tool, but it wasn't meant to replace what should be met through the budget. So if you're looking at how it started, we were short materials. We needed to produce aircraft in an emergency. It was kind of short notice, and production was in high demand. And we're talking about right now trying to fill the gap between what's already low production to that contingency level. It'd be much easier to make up that gap with the DPA if we were already producing at a level we should be. It's not meant to subsidize these industries to keep them alive. I don't think is the original intent.
Right. Now, the intent of that, the intent DPA is it's an authority where it requires a presidential determination. President Trump signed two determinations in June for, I think it was 8 projects. And these are he has to certify that this is a capability that the U.S. government needs for national security reasons, and there's no other way to do it. So that means that it's not in a service budget. It's not, there's a unique requirement. So it's a high bar to get there. It also requires it's a public-private partnership in terms of it requires cost share by the companies or the performers that are involved. So it is a unique authority. It's not budgeted in the DoD. It's very interesting, unique, powerful authority, but does not replace some of the budgetary things she's talking about.
No, I agree. I think at some point, Congress is going to have to look at kind of some of these areas that there is a shortfall, it's emergency, and we have to spend more. Whether it's more PGMs and let's put them on the shelf, and stockpiling is obviously one way of helping the industrial base, which is basically buying ahead of need. Well, so far in many of these, if you think about our munitions shortage and how we're running around trying to meet not only the needs of us but of our allies, we should have bought a lot more PGMs and ordnance a long time ago. But we can't because we have a peacetime requirement. And the reality is, so now that we should probably use the OCO funds or emergency funds or whatever, unless we can solve the BCA, which frankly I have no hope that we'll solve it before 2021 when it expires. So therefore, we probably need to declare an emergency and buy ahead of need and stockpile and help the industrial base.
Great. Next question. Sir.
Jeff Fusick, United States Navy. So my one question, and maybe I'm a little off, is as we rebuild the industrial base and create this new, shiny new technology, how do we keep that from dictating tactics? Because we have the Joint Strike Fighter that's a fantastic airframe, but everybody wants to use it to replace the A-10. And it doesn't really work, but we've brought in a thing that we're kind of putting all of our eggshells or eggs in one basket on with that airframe. And now you're going to have it have roles that it can't really take on. So how do we keep it from dictating tactics, I guess?
Who wants to go for that one?
Yeah, I'm not taking that one.
Well, awarding more contracts will be part of it. I can't speak too much to the capabilities of the F-35. Someone in the audience who can, but I'm going to steer away from that. But a part of it, again, comes down to cost savings. We wanted this overlap with components to save in spare parts in other areas. And we are trying to make a jack of all trades platform. So sometimes maybe you just got to spend a little bit more to get some more capabilities or the right type of capabilities.
And the issue is at its core form is speed. It's less a function of cost as it is speed. And the challenge with our development platforms right now is we have long lead production cycles. That, and as I mentioned before, aligning it with a legitimate mission set. And I think that's something we struggled with since the end of the Cold War, where we had a monolithic adversary teed up that we could kind of shape our force around, and that allowed us to build things like the Big Five, right? The Apache, the Bradley, the Abrams, the Black Hawk, and MLRS in 5 years, like 79 to 84. But since then, we've been struggling. So now we kind of create these mission sets that may or may not, be plausible in terms of building requirements around them. But the biggest issue is just purely speed. And that's something that we can do something about, less congressional, action.
I think your question really drives home the importance of acquisition decisions and acquisition policy on industrial policy. So, for example, our current acquisition system for major systems is, aligned around 15 to 20 years to get capability for probably a 75-year franchise. In other words, that you'll eventually incrementally modify over the course. Of course, you're not going to have more than one provider of this. The issue becomes, do we have multiple programs and we maintain multiple types of capability, so therefore we have multiple contracts that do this and not force them all into one super unified team, which we might as well just nationalize the industrial base then and do it in-house, because if we want competition, we want different capabilities out there, we have to pay for it. We have to plan for it. We have to have programs. And if you don't have programs, you have what you have.
I've got a question. Bill, you talked, I'm J.V. Venable with the Heritage Foundation. You talked about stockpiling PGMs. And Rachel, you talked earlier about efficiencies, vice effectiveness, and how we go about our planning. Logistics in the world of business is just in time. That's the way they make their money. That's the way they make things happen. And much of the defense industry has started to adopt that. Could you talk about the challenges of what that means and the risks associated with a defense industrial base that is delivering just in time? One topper on this, if I would, I was at the AFA conference last week. I listened to Lieutenant General Haragian talk about the expenditures of PGM in the Gulf, and one number was 100 PGMs per day, but Haragian corrected that as 150. We expended 5,000 in the month of August alone, and so this is a key issue, but it leads to the broader question of how do we blend efficiencies with effectiveness for the military and logistics?
I think you have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. In other words, the tremendous advances in logistics and just-in-time for the business side of defense or providing supplies and so on, we should not back off that. I mean, that's we have to take advantage of as much as possible. But you have to look at what are the key critical things that the industrial base, you can't ramp them up. It takes 2 years to start retooling and put another line in and all this. That's our missile systems. That's many of our other real capabilities. And the only way, if you want that stuff and you need it now, is to stockpile it. And I think that's essentially what. So we have to kind of make a choice. There's certain type of things, and we stockpile PGMs, but the reality is we're draining those stockpiles, and we're not filling the bucket as fastly as we could or should, at least in my humble opinion.
And planning ahead. So I think we need to stop taking procurement holidays, because they end up being more like procrastination, where it's not a holiday from any spending. You're not really getting a break. You're just pushing it further down the line. So continuing to develop those capabilities, even when maybe a threat isn't immediate, because once the threat is immediate, it's a much larger problem.
But I would hate to stockpile, you know, we don't need, there's certain things we don't need to stockpile, and we got to be careful on that. But we just have to be, do it smartly.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that, you know, the solution to some of these demand problems is not always build a new factory, right? Because, I mean, there have been in situations where some of these capability areas, munitions is one, where you have a pitch and yaw in demand and supply, and we're in a huge spike. But, you know, but it may not be the right answer to build a new factory. And if operational demand collapses, the company's going to close the factory. And we've been situations like that. So that's why we're focusing on what we call resilience and trying to figure out what are the ways that we can to get the capabilities we need, you know, and keep them around without necessarily creating infrastructure. Because we do have challenges. If you look at our reports of Congress, you'll see that some of the perennial challenge areas we have in the defense industrial base are some of these areas where are defense unique, but we don't, you know, maintaining stable demand can be very challenging. So you've got two suppliers, one of them not be that healthy, you know, so trying to do that, you know, it's really hard to manage that as a government, and we don't want to be in the business of that. So, you know, so there are challenges. You know, so you don't necessarily, the solution not always to, you know, create.
And again, I'm going to keep beating this drum. How do you get just-in-time inventory? How do you have streamlined logistics? Data. There are companies out there right now in the commercial world, Convey is one, Peloton is another, where we have existing trucks, doesn't matter what kind of truck it is, trucks, and we apply, there is a small hardware element to it, but we're applying software which relies on data of truck movements in the U.S., and now you have a lead truck, and all the other trucks have no dudes or dudettes in them, in the trucks. And they drive around, and it saves an incredible amount of money and more importantly, time. That's how you get just-in-time inventory. This is not something that we can legislate away. Like, you need the data. You need the data. You can't do. I ran a logistics operation in Afghanistan that handled 40% of all ground supply missions in the country. And like we made a lot of money, and it was very profitable, and there was a tremendous amount of danger, but also a tremendous amount of friction in the supply chain. And that was in a war zone. But if you have the data, you can make that happen. I know from personal experience you can. And that's not just with just-in-time inventory. That applies across the industrial base. But right now, we literally do not have the data. So I'm telling you, we can talk about resupply of PGMs. We can talk about just-in-time inventory. But if you do not have the data as a baseline, you don't get any of that. You don't get AI. You don't get any of the stuff that we talk about in these conferences where everyone says, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we had AI?" It does not. It starts and ends with data.
In this case, I think I'd like to have more missiles.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of, in the 2000s, we, for whatever reason, started stockpiling body armor, and we actually had, I think, 7 manufacturers of body armor. The dilemma was we kept improving it, and so our stockpiles of body armor kept being obsoleted. We went through SAPI, then ISAPI, then ESAPI, and then we probably got another kind of SAPI now. And so there is a dilemma if you stockpile something and you, in a changing world, you may come up with something better. Yeah. Another question. Before I go there, I'm going to give a heads up to my panelists. I'm going to ask you at the final round here to help Dr. McGinn write his report. And so what would you like to see in his report? And perhaps what would you not want to see in his report as he's getting ready to send this over to the White House in April? And so, sir, in the back there, please.
I think I get well for the online people. Sorry, really quickly, again, for Dr. McGinn, how do foreign suppliers factor into industrial base resiliency? I mean, is a foreign supplier considered reliance on a foreign supplier considered, you know, akin to not having a supplier at all? Is their weight given how secure we feel like that ally's industrial base is? If obviously if it's, you know, someone like China, we're not, you know, that's different than the UK or Canada now the NTIB or other NATO allies. Thank you.
Yeah, no, like I talked about, when we look at suppliers, we look at for and capability areas, we're looking for industrial base risks, and those risks, include foreign dependency, sole source, single source, fragile, suppliers that may not be looking to stay in the market because the margins in their business, in this business area that supports the DoD, may not be that high. So it is a factor that we contribute. And as you allude to, there's a big difference between a Canadian supplier and some suppliers from other countries. One of the interesting things about the industrial base that I've noticed since I've been there is that one of the risk areas that we have are in these heavily commercial areas. Because the department moves the needle for Raytheon, for Northrop Grumman, for Orbital ATK, and companies like that. These are defense companies principally. But Intel is, does not do, very, very little defense business, right? So the metals and miners, the metals industry, the DoD demand is very, very, very small in these heavily commercial areas, 1%, 3%. So we don't really move the needle on that, but there are some critical capabilities that come from that are important to the technological edge that the U.S. has. So maintaining access to that is important, and some of those capability areas are in places that we are less secure. So that is an area, but these are commercial items, and we look at these closely. But creating incentives to maintain that capability in the U.S. is one of the things we're looking at, to get more proactive in the industrial base.
Any final questions from the audience? Okay. Rachel, help Dr. McGinn here with this report. What would you like to see or not see here? Yeah.
So I liked that you mentioned materials and items that were critical for systems to support the warfighter. So I want to see essentially what you are defining as critical, and then parsing out, you mentioned steel and the DoD's relatively low demand for steel as a percentage of the total market, and making sure that is the steel the DoD uses separated from the steel used for making Coke cans and stuff like that. So that Section 232 investigations on like steel and aluminum that have been conducted recently, they aren't impacting the DoD because of some broader, vaguer idea of production capacity in those areas. And then, again, just ensuring that the results, they look at the entire DoD supply chain, including our allies and partners, and looking at how things like the Berry Amendment and Buy America provisions could be actually hurting our supply chains. And lastly, just ensuring that they don't contribute to protectionist policies, and that we look at areas of vulnerabilities and the causes behind them when we're determining how to proceed.
Thanks, Rachel. Steve?
Please don't mention cyber, AI, or big data. But yeah, only if you cede the Bill's request first. I would only say the imperative in developing resiliency in tandem with the commercial industrial base as well as the commercial investment base. I think that's a great way to lessen the load on DoD shoulders as well as Congress's shoulders. But I think more importantly, that should give us all a measure of resiliency while still allowing the commercial industry to protect their profit centers. That's a major issue. That will be the key issue, is aligning business models from people like me who are trying to build businesses with a set profit margin, and that's indisputable, and then integrating them in. And I think that's the good news story to the existing defense industrial base is saying that this is still their show, right? No one from Silicon Valley is interested in replacing Boeing or Lockheed, so I think they're interested in being helpful, often in a way that's highly complementary to their existing business model.
Thank you. Bill?
You know, I think the department will do a pretty good job on the traditional defense industrial base, and we'll do a good job of in analyzing that. And I think, you know, looking at the tools that you'll probably need, I mean, you'll probably come to the conclusion, yeah, I need more budget, and I need potentially more programs to incentivize the industrial base to do certain things. But what I would hope for you to look at it, and it may be a longer term thing, is future innovation. And yes, we'll get future innovation out of the traditional defense industrial base, but only if we have more programs, and we have more programs and more competition and more things to go after. But we can't forget that the defense industry and the rest of industry is globalized, and there are solutions out there that our allies have that we can leverage and partner with our industrial base and their industrial base. And the third area is I would dust off an old term called civil-military integration. And it's in statute. It's something that Congress amended last year to put more focus on. But the reality, no one has been talking about civil-military integration and even used the term for about 20 years in our country. But if you go across the waters and you know, Google President Xi of China and how many times he's used civil-military integration, how the Chinese are focusing on it, you can get, I think, a clear indication of why they're spending so much time in Silicon Valley and why they're trying to buy up these firms and why they're trying to take their intellectual property. It's because they get civil-military integration, and I don't think the U.S. government does. And I agree, we're not going to have, Silicon Valley's not going to be making airplanes, but it's very potentially they can link together maybe 1,000 air drones and sea drones and land drones and create a swarming offensive or defensive capability, which I think our traditional industrial base would be more than happy to build. We need that civil military. We need the best and the brightest of the United States and our allies to work on these national security problems, and I think civil military integration is a key component of that strategy. And so I would urge the department and the government to look at it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Right.
Nice.
Come in. I'm just giving you a hard time.
So we're actually
We're on tomorrow.
we're teaching
Oh, hey there.
a new thing.
Oh, yeah. Great.
Really?
I'm not kidding.
Oh, okay, great.
That'd be awesome. So, you know, I always have to kind of give that, you know. Hey, I haven't seen you in a while. How you doing? Right? Sport. I haven't seen you since California.
Yeah, California.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Doing all right. You know, keeping, trying to keep busy and keep in the fray. You know.
Vago, how you doing, sir?
Oh my gosh, it's Vago.
Well, I wouldn't miss an industrial base.
Oh, you are such the geek. I love it.
All right. Yeah, you tell me. Is that helpful?
You know, Vago never has me on his show. He never invites me anywhere. I tell you, you know,
Is he trying to grab you right now?
I am going to grab you right now. So do we both?
Oh, but
Be careful what you ask
well,
for.
yeah, I would do it, but I actually have the meeting before you're on. I got to run. Can we do it any other time?
Oh, great.